Today we review the new Canon C200. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Tomorrow's Filmmakers. My name is Justice McCraney, and yes, today we are reviewing the Canon C200. Now this camera came out about, 4 months ago, 5 months ago, something like that, and there's been so many speculations about, is this going to be the best camera? Is it going to be everything we need? Are they going to have this and this specs and this and that? And all these things that people have been wondering, we are going to talk about it. Now the awesome people over at Lens Pro To Go sent this camera to me specifically to review. So if you are ever looking to rent any sort of camera equipment, whether it's large or small, definitely check them out. They have great services and great prices. You can also use the coupon code TOMORROWS10 to receive 10% off your purchase all year round. So I didn't want to just talk about the specs of this camera. I wanted to give an entire overview of this camera and also talk about the specs. But at the end of this video, I'm going to be talking about my personal opinion on the C200, if it's great in today's market, is it the best camera in the world? Is it what we needed? What are the pros? What are the cons? And I'm going to be giving my personal opinion at the end of this video. So without further delay, let's talk about the Canon C200. Now, right whenever you pick up this camera, you can really tell a difference between the C100 and the C200. The C200 is much beefier, it's much heavier, and feels a lot more solid than the C100. It also looks very similar to the C100, so if you use the C100 before, or the C300 or C500, you will feel very comfortable and right at home using this camera. Now when it comes to pros for the C200, I think that almost every single upgrade to the outside of this camera is fantastic. I mean, Canon has listened to the shooters, and everything that was annoying about the outside of the C100, they have fixed with the C200, and every single upgrade is awesome. The side handle to the C200 is very similar to the C100. It feels very strong, I love it, it's very easy to work with. The top handle is much more solid with 2 screws holding it in place. That way there won't be any wiggle whatsoever like you kind of had on the C100. Now there are also no more audio options on the top of the handle. A huge upgrade for the C200 is that all the audio options and inputs are now on the camera body itself. This way you don't have to have the top handle attached to get great audio. You can now put the camera on a glide cam or a gimbal and still have audio options without having to have that top handle attached. Because having the audio on the top handle did get kind of annoying, so I'm really glad they put it to the camera body. We have 2 XLR inputs along with the audio options right on the back of the camera. And continuing with the outside of the camera, we have all the buttons on the side that is very similar to the C100, but they've added a few extra buttons that have made life so much easier. We have magnification, peaking, zebras, waveform, ISO, shutter speed, display, and white balance at the bottom. But one thing they have added, which has just made life so much easier, is they have added buttons for the ND filter. Now with the C100, you had that little scroll wheel, and sometimes it was really annoying, but having the buttons, it's really difficult to go back to not having buttons once you use them. It is awesome. So now with just the touch of a button, we can change the ND filters inside of the camera. And in the menu, if you extend the ND filters, we can get all the way to 10 stops of ND filters. But using the number 10 stop of an ND filter, you could probably get the correct exposure if you were shooting on the sun. Yeah, it's really dark. Now, we also have this random scroll wheel here at the bottom that controls the camera's aperture. Now, you would usually use the grip scroll to control the aperture, but I think they added this just in case you took the grip off if you wanted to use a gimbal or something like that. I guess it's useful. It's just kind of this random scroll wheel on the side of the camera, but oh well, maybe you'll use it. Now, on the back of the camera, we have the audio levels, of course, but we also have a few menu options on the camera body. I really love having an actual joystick on the camera body. It just makes life easier when you're trying to navigate the menus if you have to really break the camera down. We have the battery on the back of the C200, which unfortunately doesn't hold as much of a charge as the C100's battery did. With the C100, you could get about 5 hours of recording with one battery, which is awesome. The C200, now you can get about 2 to 2.5 hours of recording with one battery. Now, I understand it's a bigger camera, much more specs, it takes much more power to run it, so you're not gonna be getting as much battery life, but it's just kind of annoying that you have to buy a good amount of batteries. We have 2 SD card slots on the back of the camera, and the SD card slot doors are a big improvement from the C100. Right next to that, we have the SDI port, the headphone jack, the USB jack, an Ethernet port, and our power for the battery. And to the right of that, we have our remote port and our HDMI out. Now, one thing that I do not understand is that with this camera, you cannot use the HDMI output and the SDI output at the same time. So if I had a small HD monitor that I was using from the HDMI port, I could not take the cord from the SDI out to another monitor somewhere. No, that's it. So if I'm using a small HD monitor, HDMI port, that is it. I have no idea why, but they could maybe fix it in a firmware update sometime in the future, but as of right now, beginning of November 2017, they have not. The LCD screen on this camera is fantastic. Great quality, and I love the look of it. And you can mount it anywhere. So you can mount it in the front, you can mount it in the back, and this LCD screen rotates in every direction and swivels any way you want it to be. So whatever angle you need, this LCD screen can be positioned so that you can see it. I love that it is so maneuverable. You can also see that they've added a few more menu options to the outside of the screen, which makes it much more easier to work with and navigate the menus. Now, it does have some issues. I noticed that in direct sunlight, it's very difficult to see the LCD screen. Now, I know that no LCD screen looks great in straight sunlight, but I just noticed with this LCD screen, it's a little bit more reflective than my other ones have been. And with the viewfinder, Canon has done a great job upgrading it. The C100 Mark I, horrible viewfinder. C100 Mark II actually has a pretty good viewfinder. The C200 viewfinder is fantastic. You can use it to get your focus, of course, and I would go as far to say you could even use it to get color. Of course, I would still use the LCD screen, but I have used the viewfinder a lot in really bright sunlight, and it works really, really well. Now, one of the main upgrades for the C200 is the dual pixel autofocus. Now, I know that the C100 Mark II had dual pixel autofocus, but it had like no options for it. The C200 has tons of options for autofocus, and Canon has truly made me a believer in autofocus. It is actually fantastic. Using the touch screen, you can now touch what you want to be in focus. No more just trying to get everything in the middle of the box directly in the middle of the screen. Now we can actually choose where we want to be in focus in our scene. There's also a new face tracking feature, which you can tell the camera to track a face, and it actually does a really good job keeping it in focus. And this would be a really great tool to have if you're using some sort of gimbal work. The menu has also been much more simplified, and it is much easier to navigate with tons of different options, but it just feels like an upgrade. I really love it. And now we actually have 60 frames per second at 4K 8-bit and 120 frames per second in 1080p. Now, yes, I really wish that there was 120 frames per second in 4K or maybe higher than that, but hey, we have 120 frames per second in 1080p, which is actually an upgrade. Now, the 120 frames per second gives us really good slow motion. I did notice that it does bring down the sharpness a good amount, so it seems a lot more softer. But if you're looking for that option to get super slow motion, more than 60 frames per second, you can have 120 frames per second in this camera internally, which is actually really good. Maybe in the future, Canon will give us more, but as of right now, 120 frames per second, 1080p. And the low light in this camera is actually really good. I mean, the C100 had great low light capabilities, and compared to some of my 4K DSLRs, it was better, but the C200 has just continued to build on that. The low light capabilities in this camera are really, really good. And you can even extend the ISO to get to 102,400 ISO, which is utterly insane, and no, you can't use it, but they just threw that option in there. That's amazing. And now, to the biggest upgrade of the Canon C200 that people have been freaking out about and excited about, and all this fuss has been about. The Canon C200 has internal 4K RAW recording. Now, you'll notice that the Canon C200 has 2 SD card slots and 1 CFast card slot. Now, on the SD card, the Canon C200 can shoot UHD 4K up to 60 frames per second and 1080p up to 120 frames per second in 8-bit 420 color. But on the CF card, you can record 4K 60 frames per second at 10-bit color or 30 frames per second at 12-bit color. And with that, we have Canon's new Cinema Raw Lite, which is basically Canon's version of RAW. Now, this was a really big deal for Canon because this is the first camera that shoots 4K RAW. Not just 4K, but a RAW file, which is Canon's Cinema Raw Lite. Now, a lot of people are complaining that the MP4 only has an 8-bit color option, which yes, is definitely not as good as 10-bit or 12-bit. But using it for a while, I was actually pleasantly surprised by the look it gives. It really gives a fantastic looking image, even if it's only 8-bit color. Now, I'm not going to be getting into 8-bit versus 10 or 12-bit here in this video, but obviously 8-bit is not going to be as good as 10-bit or 12-bit. There's going to be more color, more detail, and a lot more quality to work with in post. So a lot of the problems that people are having with the fact that this shoots 4K 8-bit is because a lot of the mirrorless DSLRs already shoot 4K 8-bit color. So if you're going to be making the C200, which is the newest thing and it's going to be upgraded and it's going to be amazing, then why not make it better than just 4K 8-bit on the SD card? Now what Canon has done is they said we put it on the CF card in the back 4K, 10-bit, and 12-bit. Now for me personally, it doesn't bother me as much, the 8-bit, 10-bit, and 12-bit for what I shoot, and especially shooting a lot on this camera in the 8-bit mode. I was actually really surprised by the image. It looked really, really good. I didn't have any complaints about it. Yes, the 10-bit and 12-bit does give us more quality and more stuff to work with in post and did look a little bit better, but I was actually pleasantly surprised by the internal recording of this camera. So yes, I wish that there was 4K 10-bit or 12-bit on the SD card, but unfortunately, that is not the case. Now before I tell you some of the problems that I have with this camera and give you my final thoughts on it, let's first take a look at some of the footage with the Canon C200. Now, when it comes to cons with this camera, like I said, everything on the outside is an upgrade and it's fantastic, except they took the recording button off the top handle. Not sure why they did that. I love using the recording button on the top handle. Why would you take that off? But anyway, almost everything on the outside is just great. I love it. So all the cons that I have with this camera would be internally, either the specs or the functionality of it, or just some issues that I had internally with this camera. Number one, the RAW recording mode is massive, massive. A 64 gig CF card will give you about 5 to 8 minutes of RAW footage. Let me put it to you this way. If you purchase a 256 gig CF card, which will cost you about $300, you will get maybe 25 minutes of recording. 25 minutes on a 256 gig card, which is $300. Now, my Red Scarlet shoots 4K RAW images, but there are a ton of options to do different compressions, give more compression, less compression, to make the file size bigger or smaller. This, on the other hand, no compression options. It is 4K RAW, massive file sizes. So, if you're going to be shooting in RAW, you're going to need to get a ton of memory cards, a ton of them. And my second problem with this camera is actually about the memory cards. And that is the fact that to use the 4K in this camera, you have to have super fast memory cards. Now, of course, we know that we'd have to have fast memory cards, but if you invested into a ton of memory cards for your previous 4K cameras, SanDisk Ultras, SanDisk Extremes, these really fast memory cards, they were buffering in this camera and stopping recording because they were not fast enough. So now here I have tons of these super fast memory cards that worked great in my other cameras, don't do well in this camera, and I have to buy more memory cards. And it's exactly the same way for the CF cards. You have to have CF 2.0 cards that are really fast. And okay, that's great, but if you're like me and you have a ton of compact flash cards lying around from your old cameras, none of them work at all. They are literally useless in this camera. So you have to throw all those away and buy a ton of other memory cards that are super fast. Now again, I knew that there were gonna be fast memory cards involved, but it just is like, gosh, I gotta buy even more memory cards. And number 3, the Cinema Raw Lite in this camera is not compatible with major editing softwares. It will not work with Premiere Pro, and it will not work with Final Cut. Now, again, sometimes things like this happen whenever cameras come out and they're not supported, so you have to wait till this firmware comes out and updates it. So just like way in the past with some cameras that have come out, to get the footage right now in early November 2017 from your C200 into Premiere Pro or Final Cut, you have to do the whole workaround thing by making it to a different format that is compatible, which adds even more gigs in space to your computer just to be able to take the footage and edit it. So it's really annoying, and yes, they will most likely come out with firmware to fix that, but as of right now, they have not, so it's just another workaround that's really, really annoying. And another little nitpick thing that is annoying is that you cannot use the autofocus option whenever you're shooting slow motion, which is really annoying because if you are shooting slow motion, you need to nail the autofocus and you need to nail the focus very quickly and easily. And if they have such a good autofocus option, why would you not give it to me in slow motion, because I desperately need it whenever shooting slow motion? But of course, when you're shooting slow motion, you just gotta go back to manual focusing. So it's really annoying, but unfortunately autofocus is not available when shooting slow motion. And then there are 2 little things that just annoyed me about this camera. They're just little things, they're just like, why? 1, the fan is super loud and incredibly strong. I mean, you can turn off the fan in the menu system or only turn it on if the camera overheats, but I mean, just listen to this. And 2, this camera, for some strange reason, takes forever to boot up. And maybe I'm just not really used to cameras that take forever to boot up. Maybe they all take this long to boot up, all the really expensive ones, but why does this camera take so long to boot up? But again, those are just 2 little nitpicks about this camera that I didn't like. So now it is time to give you my personal thoughts about the Canon C200. The Canon C200 is an incredible camera. It has incredible looking quality images, the 4K, the Cinema Raw Lite, everything is just great. The outside has been beefed up. It is so good. But there are some major problems that it has that you really need to be aware of if you are going to purchase it. And if they are something that is just a big turnoff, maybe you need to purchase something else. For me personally, with this camera, if I was shooting client work, run and gun shooting, whatever it is, I would never use the Cinema Raw Lite. It is way too big. It is not even compatible with Premiere Pro or Final Cut. I'd have to do this whole workaround. All of my CF cards would just be eaten like that and have to invest in so many cards. The only time I would really use that is if I was filming a short film, a feature film, something really big. But if I was just doing client work, the 4K 8-bit on the SD cards is beautiful, and that's what I would use. In the future, maybe they will give us more compression options with a firmware update, and they'll fix this whole non-compatibility thing with Premiere Pro and Final Cut, which is really annoying. But right now, this is what we're stuck with. Now again, if you shoot short films all the time, and you shoot feature films, and you want to use this, for these really expensive clients where they need all of this, 10-bit, 4K, 64 gigs for 5 minutes of space on your memory card, then maybe this camera is for you, but it's not for me. So if you're someone that has a videography business that does local commercials or web videos for businesses, and you're just going around trying to find the best camera out here, I would actually not recommend this camera for you. The 4K 8-bit is really good, but again, this camera right now is still about $7,500, which is really expensive. If 4K is not a huge issue for you and you don't necessarily need 4K, I would go with the C100 Mark II. And I actually have a review on the C100 Mark II, so go check that out if you're looking into that. So for what I do a lot of commercials, I do a lot of video work, I do a lot of business work, I do some short films. If I would buy this camera, I would never, ever use the RAW recording unless I was doing a short film or something really big. I would only use the SD card 4K recording in 8-bit because it is great quality and it doesn't take up a ton of space. Now, if they gave us 4K recording in like 10-bit or 12-bit on the SD card and it's not massive, this camera would be the bomb diggity. And yes, I'm bringing that term back, the bomb diggity. This is what this camera would be. This camera is just not right for me, but it might be right for you. You just have to determine what kind of shooter you are and if all of these features are going to be a pro or a con for you with this camera. So I hope that you guys have really enjoyed this episode, and I don't know if you're interested in getting a C200 or not. I would definitely suggest renting it first, maybe try it out, see if it's something you want to do. Definitely check out Lens Pro to Go. You can rent this camera for 4 days, a week, however long you want to do it. You can also use the coupon code TOMORROWS10 for 10% off your purchase all year round. So if you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to see more, definitely check out our website, tomorrowsfilmmakers.com. We post episodes like this every single week. So we post some on YouTube occasionally, but episodes like this every single week on our website. So go check it out and you won't be disappointed. So I hope you guys have really enjoyed this episode. If you have any comments or questions about this camera, definitely let me know in the comments. I would love to hear your thoughts on it. So until next time, keep filming and God bless.